have with me a very special guest, Michael Kugelman, Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center, who's joining us from Washington, D.C. Michael, thank you for making time to be on DD India. Appreciate it.
My pleasure to be with you.
Questions have been asked about whether China acted in time to not only take steps domestically, but also alert other countries on how to take quick corrective measures to contain the spread of the virus. So if I were to ask you, Michael, in your estimation, should China bear some responsibility or accountability for its acts of omission or commission?
Oh, absolutely. I think that there are clear cases of history repeating itself with this pandemic. I think it's reminiscent of what happened with SARS, for example, the previous SARS, as well as the avian flu pandemic, where you have a situation where it began in China. Right. Yet Beijing was very slow to respond, and then when it knew what was going on, it essentially suppressed information about what was happening, thereby allowing not only more people to get infected in China, but then for the disease to spread beyond its borders. And each successive pandemic we've had that originated in China, the world has been more globalized, which means there's more damage. The world is more vulnerable, and I think that's what happened now. I mean, to its credit, China has indeed sort of changed. It's lurched from one extreme to the other. Initially, it was denying anything that was happening, right. And now it's going into overdrive, trying to provide supplies, trying to use its convening power to manage global responses. I think there's a sense of guilt there, but I also think it wants to take advantage of this situation to pursue its strategic goal of expanding, spreading its influence and clout around the world.
Indeed. Now, Michael, you're joining us from Washington, D.C., and not far from where you are, a gentleman called Donald Trump in the White House says both the U.S. and Australia are in favor of an independent investigation into the origin and spread of the virus. What's the state of play insofar as the investigation goes? I mean, is it being seriously considered? And is there a critical mass of countries, you think, which are joining issue with the US and Australia to call for a probe into the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus or the coronavirus or COVID-19, by whatever name you call it?
Well, I think clearly there is a growing consensus in favor of taking a harder line on China. And, I think it's not just because of how we've seen China respond initially to the virus, but also the way in which China has considered to aggressively pursue its interests in the course of this pandemic. As you know, there have been a number of reports of China using aggressive activities in the South China Sea in terms of how it's dealt with Vietnam and some other countries. And a number of nations are concerned about that. Why should China be acting that way? Why should it be trying to exploit a deadly pandemic to do things like that, thinking that people would not notice? So yes, I think there's reason to think that there could be a groundswell of global support for an investigation of China, but I think that now is not the time for that. I think now so many countries around the world, and certainly the United States, have to focus above all else on getting the pandemic under control within their borders. I mean, that clearly, we are really suffering here in the United States, as you know. So there will be a time. There should be a time for that investigation, but not now. Give it at least a few weeks or a few months.
Right. And talking about other countries in the region and beyond, Michael, let's start with India first. What did you make of India's response to the coronavirus pandemic in terms of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's initiative or decision to enforce a nationwide lockdown for a country of the size and scale as India with 1.3 billion plus people, also imposing a flight ban early on, and then going on to diplomacy where India shared medical supplies such as hydroxychloroquine and paracetamol with other countries. So in your estimation, how would you describe India's response domestically and internationally to the coronavirus pandemic?
I would describe India's response both domestically and globally as robust and bold. So, as you know, the number of confirmed cases and deaths in India have been high, but nowhere near as high as they've been in so many other countries, including the US, China, and many countries in the West and in East Asia. And I think that the lockdown that the Prime Minister announced, I think we have to look at. We don't really know why at this point the cases are where they are. But certainly the fact that Modi very quickly and abruptly declared that nationwide lockdown for initially 3 weeks, I think you have to look at that as a potential factor. If you look at some of the other countries in the world, just Germany, for example, or New Zealand, where you haven't had the scope of the deaths as you've had in other places, you have that consistency of immediate aggressive actions, lockdowns. And so I think that Modi's decision, of course, was criticized heavily initially, including by people like myself, for worrying that it happened too soon without enough pre-planning, concerns about what it would mean economically. Now, certainly it will have economic consequences, but the public health factors, I think, are more important. The verdict is still out as to how effective it was, but I think that we need to credit the prime minister for that bold and robust decision. In terms of the global response, well, as you know, we live in a world where multilateralism is certainly not dead, but it certainly is very much absent. And for the prime minister to spearhead an effort through the SAARC countries in which he coordinated some type of regional response, I think that's to be praised, and also his efforts to try to push the G20 to host a virtual meeting on responses to the pandemic. As I understand it, he was one of the leaders that took the major leads in doing that. That's significant because, again, there haven't been any other efforts. The U.S. certainly is not taking any initiative to wage a global response, unlike what you had with President Obama during the Ebola pandemic some years ago.
And just to amplify your point about Prime Minister Modi, Michael, he has spoken about in the first phase of saving lives, and then moved on to talking about life and livelihood. So that's how he has approached this issue. But moving from India's domestic politics to American domestic politics, Michael, in your estimation, what kind of an impact might this have on Trump's re-election campaign? The virus pandemic, I mean.
Right. Well, it's an interesting point. I mean, there have been some polls that have come out, some surveys that have come out over the last few weeks that show that Trump's approval ratings have actually increased, which is very striking. Yeah, which is very striking. Certainly, I think it really depends on the economic cost. I think that we know already that the U.S. is suffering economically. And there was that shocking stat some days ago that you had, 22 million Americans file for unemployment within just several weeks' time, which is unbelievable. I think one of the reasons why President Trump has pushed to open the country up for business sooner than many people, including his own medical experts, believe is appropriate, is that he knows that his rank and file is worried and is suffering. And so I think that he fears that he needs to show that he's taking their considerations into mind. I think that Joe Biden, his opponent, has been strengthened by the pandemic. It's given him a better chance in a one-on-one match with Trump. I would argue that Biden is a much weaker candidate than he would have been in 2016. He doesn't seem quite as strong and robust. But I will say that it will be a closer race between Trump and Biden than I would have thought some months ago. I really don't know who's going to win, but I think Trump is more vulnerable now than he's been at any time before, especially because, the pandemic has really been the first true crisis he's had to face as president. And many people, including many of his supporters, think that he acted too late, that his tone and his messaging has been very inappropriate, and that he simply is not doing a good job.
Indeed. Now, Michael, I want you to take a step back and reflect on the so-called post-corona new world order. So if I were to ask you, Michael, what might this post-corona new world order look like, and what might be, Asia's or India's role in it?
Well, it's a good question. And there have been so many commentaries indicating that, the world is going to change, it'll never be the same, and things like that. I'm not sure if I would go that far. I think that much of the world order will remain the same, quite frankly. I mean, in terms of geopolitical manifestations, the U.S.-China rivalry will still be there. Those will still be the two major powers, even though both countries will have suffered considerable economic damage, not to mention public health damage. I think in the immediate term, globalization will take a hit just because so many countries are going to be focused on inward policies to try to get their economies to recover. Certainly, if current trends and patterns hold and the developing world does not experience the damage, the public health damage that so much of the developed world has experienced, that could provide opportunities for countries like India to try to take on more of a leadership role in spearheading more multilateralism, maybe through some regional groupings or some global groupings that have been moribund, like the BRICS arrangement, for example. So I think there could be some opportunities for India there. But again, I think that the major realities will stay the same. I mean, U.S.-China rivalry will remain the same. India-China rivalry will remain the same in your region where you are there. And I think that globalization will continue to struggle, but it'll recover. I mean, countries know that in order to get their economic growth going beyond the immediate term, there needs to be trade. There needs to be more trade. So I think that things will relatively not necessarily return to normal, but I don't think we're going to have a revolutionary change that so many have suggested could happen as we had, say, after the end of the Cold War. The world will change for sure, politically, economically, social interactions, that type of thing. But in terms of world order, I don't think we should overstate the major change that we could see ahead of us.
And would you describe the COVID-19 pandemic as a 9/11-like moment, a potentially 9/11-like moment, in the sense that the understanding or concept or definition of security as you and I understood it so far might be undergoing a change, and that health security might be front and center of the narrative going forward?
Yes, no, I definitely think you're right. I mean, the notion of human security, non-traditional security threat, which many analysts, including myself, have highlighted for so long, water shortages, health challenges, these are very real and very, very deadly challenges right now. But indeed, you're right. I imagine that will become, that'll come to the fore, that interpretation of security. But I would go beyond 9/11. Sure. I do think that at least conceptually, I think that this moment, the pandemic, what it means for the world, is indeed comparable to the post-Cold War period, just because the politics will change significantly. The economies will be so shattered in so many different places. And also, I think that the most critical thing is that the idea of social interactions will change. I think that the way in which people interact physically will change. Distancing may be something that's recommended for a long time, indefinitely. The way in which airlines operate, people not sitting next to each other, all of that could change. And so I think that goes beyond 9/11, which I think, in terms of how things changed, was restricted to security concepts. But now we're talking about much broader paradigm shifts in terms of how we think about not only the world and how it operates, but how societies should operate.
And I want to wrap up by just asking, going back to the China question now, I'm going to help our viewers understand. Many people are wondering aloud, why is China so dead against a probe? What is China's reservations on an investigation, number one? And number two, why is China so worried about it being called the Wuhan virus? What has China got to hide from the world, if it has?
Well, I mean, China is an authoritarian state, but it still worries about what people think. It worries about its image. It really values its soft power. And I think that the idea of accountability is not something that's very familiar or desirable to the regime there. I mean, it is an authoritarian state, so I think it's unhappy about that. It doesn't want to be embarrassed or humiliated. And same goes for this notion of whether we should be calling the virus the Wuhan virus. Yes, I mean, it does seem like it originated there. So why not call it the Wuhan virus? But again, I think China doesn't want too much attention brought to a pandemic, to a virus that has become a huge pandemic, in part because of China's own lack of action in the early days of the pandemic. But I think that's the answer to your question, that it simply doesn't want this negative publicity, this negative attention. It wants to be seen as a responsible major power and even a superpower. And in that regard, an investigation of the way in which it's handled the pandemic certainly does not serve its interests.
Right. On that note, Michael, thank you so much for joining us on DD India. Appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And that's a wrap on this special broadcast. But news continues here on DD India. You can catch all the latest updates on our social media, mobile and digital platforms. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.